So, we are back for yet another episode of the Knight Brothers Commentary. Today is a special episode. We've got a guest with us, and I'm going to kind of let him introduce himself here in a little bit, but we're excited to bring him on. We're ping-ponging around topics, as we always do. Last time we talked about a little bit of the NFDL, which was Matt's idea for a developmental league that kind of coexists with the NFL, but we're gonna ping pong back, like I said, to a topic that we had, 3 or 4 months ago, Matt, when we started discussing autism, which is obviously something that hits close to home for us. Matt lives as an autistic person. Obviously you've been that way your entire life, and it shapes a lot of our discussion here on this podcast. Really, it is at the root of why. A lot of why we do this is to bring some unique perspective, I think, and allow you to share kind of the way you see the world, which is very different from how neurotypicals, as you would put it, which is the rest of us, I guess, see things. So we're excited to bring somebody on today that kind of plays in that arena. And again, I'm going to let him introduce himself here. Steve, hey, welcome to Knight Brothers Commentary.
Thank you. First off, big fan of the show.
Thank you.
I'm not going to share my last name just to protect myself. Local school teacher here in Hamilton County, and obviously been teaching for 8 years and have had all kinds of students of different areas on that autism spectrum, call it what you will. Excited to share my expertise, I guess you would call it, and just excited to be here, guys.
Perfect. And we're excited to have you, Steve. And this is something new for us, in terms of bringing somebody on with some outside expertise. Matt and I have shared our opinions, obviously, over the course of several of these podcasts, but excited to have Steve on today. So with that being said, Matt, I kind of want to turn it over to you to kick it off in terms of just questions and where your mind's at with having this guest on, and just kind of let the conversation roll from there. There's no, timeline for this. We can go as long or as short as we want, but Matt, as always, I just kind of want to kick it off to you to get the show rolling.
All right, Steve. So my first question is, could you just give us a brief overview of your experience with working with autistic individuals as a teacher, just kind of both the good and the bad, just to kind of start us off?
Sure. I teach at the middle school level, and obviously at a public school, you're going to have students of all different levels. We do teaming at my school, which is kind of an attempt to level the kids, usually for their math and their language arts classes. My team usually gets a heavy caseload of students with learning disabilities. That there are several kids that are autistic, several kids that have a whole range of learning disabilities that we work with. And really, the past 3 or 4 years, that's been kind of my team's niche. Is we have a lot of students on our caseload with specific learning disabilities. I guess as a science teacher, I guess my classroom is I don't have a an honors science, an advanced science, a science remediation class. I have everybody. I have the highest of high students and the lowest of low, all mixed together, which can be a challenge for me, meeting everybody's their present level in science class. But I love science because you can have your highest of high student working with your lowest of low student, and science is a lot of team-based work, and that there's a lot of successes and obviously a lot of failures when you have such a range of cognitive ability. But I don't know if you're familiar with terms like IEP, Individualized Education Plan. Basically, every student has the right to education in their best environment, their best arena, whatever suits them best. So students with autism could have things like you need to be very mindful about their environment that you place them in the classroom, like preferential seating, for example. There's some students that you have to be very mindful to put them away from, those students that are very distracting especially in a science classroom, which already has all kinds of extra stimuli. Being very mindful about that. As far as accommodations for testing, for example, we'll stick with autism here. Some of my autistic students do really well with having a test read aloud to them. That looking at a test on paper or on a computer on their own is very overwhelming to look at everything that they're going to have to go through, but having it just simply read to them is an accommodation that helps them. I guess for the past 8 years, it's kind of trial by fire, trying to figure out what's best for these students, and I really enjoy it. I really enjoy the challenge, because really every student, whether you're on the spectrum or not, everyone has to have their own tailor-made educational plan, and that's kind of what you figure out over the course of a 185-day school year.
Yeah, and Matt, I don't want to jump you, but I got a couple of follow-up questions, just because that's really unique perspective for us, and I'm curious when you're talking about some of those like IEPs, and I agree. I think that's a great way to go about it in terms of individualizing it. Are you bringing, other instructors? Are you bringing in parents? Are you bringing in outside influence, or is that something that you guys are working on, case by case on your own as a teacher? Do you have outside influence to try and help you? Maybe there's been experiences in other classrooms or life experiences that parents can provide, context to develop that IEP.
So let me make sure I have your question correctly. Are you saying like when we start the IEP process or the ongoing process?
I guess more so the ongoing process in terms of, I assume each year you're starting kind of with a blank slate. I mean, obviously the kids have been in the system. Some have, some haven't, right? So maybe there's some prior, experience to go on from previous years, right? Whether
Sure.
you talk to a teacher, that had him the year prior, 5th grade, 4th grade, whatever that may be. I'm just curious how involved, how many outside influencers are involved in that process.
Okay. So let's go from a student that already has an IEP. What you would do is at least annually, you would have all the stakeholders sit down and review it. That would be teachers, parents. You could even have outside therapists could be a part of the conversation, either in person or over the phone. And you really dissect, all right, this is what the plan is. This is what is working. This is what I see working. This is what I see not working. Sometimes you have plans in place that started in 1st grade, and now that we're in 6th grade, there are things in there that we don't need anymore. So it's a matter of, okay, these are the things that we have, and we get feedback from all the teachers. And in middle school, you have a different science teacher, math teacher, language arts teacher, social studies teacher. So you got a lot of different avenues of feedback, and you go through that and you decide, okay, these are the struggles that we're still having. These are the struggles that I think we have overcome, and maybe we don't need this accommodation anymore. So I guess it's just constantly evaluating, okay, what is this student's least restrictive environment? We don't want to put too much, we don't want to do too little, and you're constantly looking at what are those things that we could be doing better. And I guess you can get that feedback can come from everywhere. The more information, the better.
Matt, are you trying to jump in?
Yeah, I was trying to jump in.
Yeah,
so,
please, go ahead.
I mean, that actually kind of lines up with my experience with IEPs within the Fishers public education system, because I remember kind of going to those meetings as a kid, or even just in high school, actually. I remember going to those meetings trying to set up, okay, here's what Matt's doing well, here's where he's maybe struggling a little bit, here's where we can just try to maybe try to improve things a little. So I remember kind of going for those meetings, talking about my IEP, because I had one for the Fishers education system as well, or rather the HSC system, as we would call it here. Mm-hmm. But for me, I would say probably my question is, do you work with voc rehab counselors yet, or is that too early for this stage? Because I've been working with VR counselors ever since I would say at least since I graduated high school, but especially during college is when I really started hitting it hard. But are VR counselors still kind of like too early for this stage of education, or is it more just kind of like?
Yeah, in sixth grade, it's not something that's happening a whole lot yet, but we do have all kinds of counselors that are chiming in. Every now and then we'll have therapists, doctors sending us feedback forms or little inventory tests for us to take. That it's just all about data, whether the data is coming from the school or from a doctor, a therapist, whatever. It's all about putting all that together and coming up with the best plan. So, we meet with these counselors more so over the phone or via email. Very rarely do we have them coming in to work with us one-on-one.
Yeah. No, go ahead. To be honest, when I say VR counselors, I'm saying like the Family and Social Services Administration. So kind of like helping people with employment. Because those are typically what voc rehab counselors do, especially at my age now. But I think VR counselors also do more, especially like just helping people with their IEPs for someone like your students in sixth grade. But
not so much in the middle school. That's probably something more common as you get closer to. Okay, what's that end goal in high school? Are we diploma track? Are we not? Are we? What are those next steps? I think that's where they probably come in.
Yeah, that's fair.
Steve, I want to ask you in terms of, your education, and we can keep this to, the autism spectrum or just learning disabilities in general. Are you being offered or taken through ongoing training by your employer to help? Because what the challenge that I see, and I think Matt would agree with this, and Matt, if you don't, please chime in, is that the data and the understanding continues to change in terms of how well we understand the things that influence those on the spectrum. I'm just going to use that as an example, how they learn, what they respond to best, the environments. And I get it, it's all individualized. I understand that. But in terms of painting with a broad stroke, are you being provided ongoing education, or is this something where you just have to kind of feel it out as you go in terms of like every year? Is there anything related to here's what we're doing from a learning disability standpoint?
Sure.
We're employing this new program. We believe that this has utility for our students.
Yeah, I feel like, especially being on that team, that academic team that really has the heavier numbers of students with disabilities, let's call it. We're provided with the opportunities to, and really it's not optional. It's you're going to these professional developments, whether they're local or they'll even send us across the country if they see value or purpose in it. So we definitely do get ongoing professional development, and to your point of I do see that every couple of years there's some kind of new author that's out there, or brain-based researcher that tells us the new way that you need to do something, and I feel like we do jump on that. And we at least try it for a couple of years, and then it seems like there's a cycle. Okay, you should be doing this. Okay, no, that's kind of old school. We don't do that anymore. Let's try this. I feel like there's a cycle of every couple or few years of here's the new brain-based research on this, and this is what you need to be doing or trying. So it is an ongoing cycle of strategies. And, there are teachers that are reluctant to the change because, they've been teaching for 20, 30, 40 years, and they know what's best. And you're not going to come in and tell me that just because this scientist that isn't even an educator knows exactly what a classroom of 35 kids and what those 3 or 4 special needs students need. It's tough sometimes to get that feedback or that mandate, you need to be doing this, when you're not sure that you believe in it yourself yet. But every few years there's a cycle of new research and new strategies that we are supposed to be trying.
And do you think, and we'll kind of, I have an idea of where I want to shift this conversation to in a minute, but I do have one more question there. As far as that goes, obviously I think that's an ideal scenario for an educator to, I mean, everything that you've spelled out from the IEP, from the team, the team strategy to this ongoing education program. Is that something that is that across the board in education, or is that district specific? For example, I don't know if you have any, friends or colleagues that work in other school systems. Do you think that permeates into other school systems, or is it a matter of funding? Is it a matter of, quality, whatever it may be? Are they getting a different experience at a private school versus a public school? I'm just curious how universal something like that is, or if there is an opportunity or a chance that several students are missing that support that they probably desperately need.
Well, I guess there's several things in there.
Yeah, sorry, very layered.
One part is I know from a funding standpoint, all public schools are given funding to do these kinds of things, funding to send their teachers to professional developments. How the school districts choose to use them is, I think, under their discretion. But there is money going to every school district as a means of doing these things. And then your question of, are all students receiving access to X, Y, and Z strategies that are new and learned? Every student has the right, if they qualify for an IEP, every student in a public school has the right to get the services that they need. And it would be against the law in a public school to not get those services that they qualify for. That's different if you're talking about a private school. A private school, if they feel like they don't have the means of giving you the services that you need, they're not going to take you. They're not going to take you on. And the public school setting, that's part of what a public school is. You have to meet every individual learner's needs. And so if that means, certain schools have to have more money coming in because they have more students with disabilities, which I think a lot of times happens in an area like we live in, where the stigma around the school district is that they're very good at what they do with students with special needs. Sometimes you have a higher population of those students, and therefore more funds are needed. And that's when you get into, how are you using the funds? Do we need referendums to get more money coming in to make these things happen? But I kind of want to take the conversation in a different direction if we can.
And maybe we're on the same page. So please do. Matt, do you have anything to chime in before? Because I think Steve and I are going in the same direction here, but any other questions before we kind of make the shift?
I do, actually, and I feel like this may actually take us a little bit off course, but the question that I have in mind is, what makes a student qualified for an IEP? So, how do they qualify to have their own individualized education plan?
Excellent question. So I think what you're saying is what gets the process started. That can come from a bunch of different directions. It can come from a teacher recognizing, hey, I think this student is in need of more services. What can we do about that? And then you start the investigation, I guess you could call it, as to what is the root of the problem. And, you could go to the avenue of, the parents taking their child to a specialist, a doctor, to put a diagnosis on something, put a label on it. Okay, it's autism, or okay, it's ADHD, or okay, it's, dyslexia, X, Y, and Z, whatever you want to call it. A lot of times it's the parents already have an idea that their student is a struggling student, and they're the ones that push and pursue the process to begin. Other times it's, I'll get students at the middle school level and they're really struggling, and I'm wondering, wow, how do they not have anything? They've gone this whole time without any assistance, and I feel like they're well below the typical average student, and so we can kind of get the process going too, but it always requires, it helps to have that label on it. Okay, this is a student with ADHD. Okay, let's go from there. How do we attack? What are the lagging skills that this student needs attacked? So the process can get started from a variety of different avenues. Most commonly, if I'm starting the process, we get our guidance department would get involved. We would get our we have like a disabilities coordinator that would get involved, that would start that process with testing, gathering a bunch of data from the classroom about, if it's a student with ADHD, let's say, tracking how much time the teacher, or if there's an instructional assistant in the room, how much time they see that this student is off task, or doesn't seem to be paying attention, or things like that. It's all about bringing in as much data as you can to prove that, this student really does need these services. Because bottom line for a school district is every time you're doing this, that student has just become more expensive. So you've got to prove that this student actually needs it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so where was this?
Well, I was just thinking, I guess before the show, that the tricky part about the label with autism is the broadness of autism. I have students that are, if you visualize the autism spectrum all the way on one side, where they're not diploma track, they're not, it would be better served for them to be learning those life skills, just survival, as opposed to all the way at the other end where I see more of a Matt Knight, more of that Asperger's, high functioning, that end of the spectrum where you are still, very capable of being in society on your own. And I think the challenging part is, when people say, well, why is autism all of a sudden, blowing up in numbers? Why are there so many of our students now getting diagnosed with it? I think it's always been there. I think it's always been, it's just there's students that are slow. There are students that are different. And we didn't necessarily always have the label, but I think it's always been there. And I think we're doing a better job of, okay, here's a label for it. Now what? And I just feel like the challenge with the autism spectrum is each autistic child is, it's not like there's a one size fits all fix to help them. There's so many different characteristics of someone that has autism and what they could struggle with. Whether it's struggling with extraneous stimuli in a classroom, sometimes it's too much, and students will have to wear, headphones to block out all the extra noise and all the extra lights and all the extra commotion of a school setting. Or
Matt loves loud noises.
Yeah, that was something I always kind of struggled with, like fire alarms. Oh, I hated those as a kid in school. It drove me nuts.
Yeah, or a loud basketball arena. Everybody's going nuts constantly. That can be overwhelming. And I guess the spectrum is just so wide. I have autistic students in my classroom that you would have no idea. You would have no idea just looking at them, listening to them, that they even have autism.
I know, and that's one thing that I noticed throughout my entire high school and even college career, that people would just say, hey, I had no idea that you were on the spectrum. I had no idea that you were suffering from this disability to be fair, it is a disability.
Sure.
Are people like me, the high functioning ones, really capable of doing great things? Yes, we really are. But there are things that we do struggle with on a daily basis. Just kind of like, for example, just communicating is really kind of a big challenge. Because sometimes we just miss things that we don't necessarily pick up on the small, subtle things that most neurotypical people would get, even though we have the intellectual capacity to understand it.
And in education, we often talk about it being seeing the grays, where my autistic learners are very black and white, and not all, but trying to think about my typical autistic student, which there's such a range there, but seeing the grays, in humor, sense of humor can sometimes be challenging for autistic students. They're very literal. they have a hard time seeing the grays, or, if we have to change up our schedule for the day. That could be to the typical student that, okay, no big deal. We're going to have this period at this time. It's going to be shortened. It's going to be, but for someone that likes things very routine, you just blew up their world for the day, and it could be overwhelming, and you have lost them for the entire day. Something that the neurotypical just wouldn't understand. Okay, you're telling me that lunch is going to be at this time instead of this time. Okay, no big deal. But for some of my autistic students, I just messed up their whole world for the day, and it's just, it's that black and white, very, structured system that an autistic student typically needs.
And I'd like to kind of, so we're starting to go in the direction that I kind of think makes the most sense here, because a lot of this stuff is really good. And I don't mean to, I'm not trying to downplay anything that we've discussed thus far, because I think it is important from an education standpoint to try to do everything we can to certainly, as you said, Steve, if there is someone who is diploma track, to get them there and support them. I think we all know, and Matt, obviously you were able to go on that track and get your diploma, and then take that into, UIndy, University of Indianapolis, and get your degree, which for a lot of autistic people is not a reality. So kudos to you. Honestly, I mean, that's a huge accomplishment. But I guess the direction that I'm trying to get us down, maybe for the latter half of this discussion is, so Matt, you have, from an education standpoint, I think you've achieved or exceeded anything that an educator could try and do for an autistic student, right? Diploma track all the way through. You get to college, you get the degree, you were very involved. And yet here we stand, you're 27 years old, and you're still trying to figure out, from a career standpoint, how to find your fit, right? In terms of your career and how you gain this independence that I think everybody as an adult wants to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I've graduated college back in May of 2015, if I remember right. So it's been almost 5 years since I've graduated. And I have gone on to get more education, like my A+ certification, and I'm now currently studying for my Network Plus. So for me, kind of on my own journey, trying to find my own fit in the corporate world, I feel like that's probably the best way. That was a good way to put it. But for me, I would say that's something that really, I would say the real struggle is kind of emotional, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Just because, to be honest, I feel like I was just gotten so used to academic success that I thought that would just automatically translate into the corporate world. And it hasn't. And I think one of the main reasons why is because of, I just communicate in a way that's not necessarily understood by other professionals. I feel like that's the main thing that really kind of hinders the employability, if you will, of high functioning or even possibly low functioning autistic individuals. So do you have any comments on that, Steve?
Well, there's lots of different places we could go with this. I feel like,
I just want to jump in really quick,
go ahead,
because this is exactly where I'm wanting to take this, and I'll turn it back over to Steve, because this to me is the missing link, if you will. He's checked the boxes from an education standpoint, but it's the socialization, it's the social skills that, while Matt was checking the boxes all along the way from an academic standpoint, which has never been an area that you've struggled, your capacity is very high. I would say certainly higher than mine, or higher than many people that I know. But I do think, just using sixth grade as a contextual standpoint, because that's relevant to Steve, I do think where we're missing the mark is the socialization early on, developing or attempting to develop these social skills, because you can create an environment for Matt to learn in a classroom, and that's great. But it's all those intangibles, if you will, that because someone else, a sixth grade student who is a neurotypical, not on the spectrum, may have just not understood how to interact with Matt because of the two different perspectives that they were coming from. I'm curious, Steve, what your thoughts are on how we can start addressing this socialization at a younger age, so that when Matt, is sitting here at 27 years old and getting ready to walk into an interview, there isn't so much of this, I don't want to call it self-doubt, Matt, but some of this angst. I see you before your interviews. You carry a lot of angst. It's not something that's comfortable for you, just going and meeting somebody new and having that social interaction. So I'm kind of trying to take the conversation in this social direction, and how you see that as an educator play out as a kid, because truly these are when these skills are learned for the most part.
Right. I mean, for the typical student, that socialization, social skill is just learned by living in it.
It's just a natural occurrence.
And we soak it in. We especially in middle school, it's such a quirky age. You're seeing, what are the things that I do socially that are giving me the attention that I like? Some of my autistic students don't care to play in that game. That, like Matt said, they are, academically, they're gonna check their boxes, but the social side of school isn't one of those things that they're really focusing on. What we will do for those students, I mean, we give them those speech services, which include the social settings. But again, with someone that's autistic, it's a challenge, because so much of social is not just read out of a textbook. Strategies, okay, Matt could have a bunch of strategies lined up in his head ready to pull out, but socialization is such a natural thing. It just, to think about it and then do it becomes more robotic. And I think that's the biggest challenge. I don't know how you address that lagging skill of being able to be confident in one's social standing, social ability. I certainly think that we can practice. I wish in high school we were practicing more of those soft skills that you're going to need. Matt's got all the academic knowledge, all that content, but those soft skills, like how to nail the interview, you can't. There's not a test that you take on paper that tells you this is how you nail the interview. How you could put charisma into, like, how would you teach someone charisma?
I don't know if you can. I mean, I don't know if there's...
I do have one example, and I would say this is probably more so for high school students than, say, middle schoolers. But I would say we need to have a class, or maybe at the very least, just have more mock interviews in high school. Because I feel like I may have done something like that back in junior high, I think.
Well, you probably took speech as a class.
Yeah, I took speech as a class. And I would just say, like, maybe like as a test or something, like make the students do like a mock interview with a teacher at some point.
And I think that does exist. That's actually one of the courses that you have to take. Is just one course enough? I feel like that's something, especially for an autistic student, that needs to be an ongoing part of their education. And for many of my students, it is. It is a part of their ongoing education. It's just very difficult to teach that.
And I agree. I mean, it really is, especially since for someone like me and possibly many others who just didn't really care at the time, we were just focused more on our studies or just playing whatever sports we wanted to play, or did whatever extracurricular activities that we wanted to do, like theater or art or whatever. I mean, we were just more interested in I guess living in the moment per se, and not really thinking long term, like, okay, I'm going to need these kinds of life skills in order to actually be able to work. I mean, we just didn't have that mindset.
And that's
I know I didn't.
That's very typical for every student. Every kid out there is not, most are living in the moment. They can't see, in 20 years I'm going to need to nail this interview. No, they're just worried about, I wonder what Brad's doing after school today. I want to go play football in the backyard. They're not thinking about, those soft skills that you're going to have to gain. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for an autistic learner is that social skill it's just not natural. Whereas the neurotypical, as you call it, it's just absorbed. It's not something that you're putting extra thought into learning. it's just happening, and that's a big challenge, I think.
And I think, it definitely is. I mean, I can speak from my personal experience. I've had several interviews in my life, and I would consider it one of my, primarily just based on feedback that I've received, one of my strengths. In my career, I don't have an angst going into an interview. I obviously, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it that relieves me of some of that stress because I do feel prepared. But it wasn't something that I certainly was ever taught. There was no curriculum. It was something that I picked up naturally along the way because of my socialization as a young adult or a child or whenever that occurs. So I guess, I'm curious as to why. I think there's been this debate for a long time around education, and I'm not just talking about social skills. There's a whole side of life that for some reason has not entered the educational realm at really any level. You can take something from personal finance, right? Understanding how to balance a checkbook, understanding, how does a mortgage work? How does an auto loan work? How does some of these, how does my health insurance work? Some of these fundamental things that for many people, neurotypical or otherwise, are huge barriers to independence. And again, I'm not trying to be Mr. Conspiracy Theory here, but to me, it's, we talked about Common Core, whatever. This is common sense to me that there should be something like this.
I think many feel the same way. Why are we throwing away, I can tell you why, but why are we throwing away the home ec?
Yeah.
Why are we throwing away, personal finance classes?
And to me,
money.
It is money, and we all know that. But at the end of the day, for me, I think back in terms of some of the most, from a learning standpoint, some of the most impactful things that I've had in my life. And I'll just give you guys one example of again, where I'm trying to take this is, in my career, I had an opportunity with Shaw to do a program called Emerging Leaders. And it was like a retreat style program where it was not facilitated by anybody within our organization. It was a coaching, leadership development program that was done by kind of a consulting group. And one of the interesting things that I found was they took people from all across our company in different channels of business. So we had absolutely no relationship going in on the front end, right? So we were starting from zero and immediately were immersed into an environment where socialization was not an option. In order to get what we were meant to get out of this experience, whether it was through, sharing parts of our lives, some, I would call it kind of being vulnerable from the outset, going through sort of task or project style case scenarios where we were each given a critical role in achieving, our desired outcome, right? There wasn't an opportunity for, if Matt chose to sit out because he didn't feel like being social that day, well, we were all going to fail, right? It wasn't going to work. So it was really more experiential learning. Again, not something that can be really tested. I mean, there was a finish line, so to speak, where we were, either what we built worked or it didn't, but that wasn't really the point, right? It was more just about the experience along the way. And yeah, it was a good, go us moment at the end if it happened to work out in terms of building something of value. But I guess where I'm going is for the context of this conversation, I think something like that being integrated into our curriculum or at least offered, from a young age, whether it's through a public education system or through something completely privatized, right? A company or something like that focuses on bringing people together, whether they're on the spectrum or not, and just allowing them to interact, forcing conversation. I mean, it's almost like, it's like a social club. I mean, you're giving people who may be a little bit reluctant to jump into that social arena, Matt. And I guess I'd like your opinion on this. I mean, if you can think back to your time in school, were there times where you were intimidated to jump into social settings because you just felt like your communication skills maybe weren't as strong as some of the others in the class? I mean, is that a fair?
I would say, yeah, that is pretty fair. For me, I would say it's probably less of a fear of having bad communication skills and more of just an unwillingness to do it because I just hated talking to people. And also, I just didn't really care for the topic at hand as well at times. So
You don't see the value in it.
yes, it's more of like I just don't see the value as opposed to having just outright fear.
So let me ask you this. Now sitting here, and I'm just playing devil's advocate, I understand not seeing the value and not caring to talk about certain things, but understanding that some of the limiting factors in your life today surround your ability to communicate both verbally and non-verbally with other people, do you wish that you had maybe spent some more time focusing on those soft skills, even though it wasn't your top priority as a child?
Honestly, I have to say I'm 50-50 because it's kind of hard to explain because as an adult, kind of looking back at my experience through the educational system here in America, I would say yes, because I do feel like I do lack that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm not really sure if it's something that I could have learned.
Without the motivation to
Well, it's not just motivation. It's more of just kind of like, I'm trying to think of the right word here. It's more of a natural ability, so to speak. It's more of just kind of like of how I learn. Because I know I'm not the only one on the spectrum that struggles with nonverbal stuff. And this is something that I have struggled with my whole life. I mean, I can look at your body language right now and I'm just like, okay, what is he talking like what's he trying to communicate via that way? I mean, that's what I'm saying when it comes to communication. It's because sometimes I wasn't really sure how. I'm not sure how you can teach an autistic person to really understand nonverbal language in the same way that a neurotypical would.
And man, I don't. Go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry.
And and I know again the spectrum's huge, but is that something that we should be striving for? Is making every autistic child more like the neurotypical, or should we find their strengths and find a way to let those strengths be what defines them?
That's a good question. And I would say I kind of took the latter approach. And to be fair, I mean, it has worked to a degree. It really has. I mean, I am probably a little bit more accomplished than a lot of autistic people are. Or at least that's how I see myself. I don't want to put anyone else on the spectrum down when I say that, but I feel like it is true at least when it comes to my educational achievements, because I do have a college degree and I do have a technical certification and working on a second one. So in that sense, one could make an argument that I'm more accomplished.
Well, if I could jump in with you here.
Yeah, it's okay.
Some of what makes autism so beautiful is the obsessive compulsiveness.
Yes.
That can come with it. And,
you have no idea.
And that could be a beautiful thing. It could also drive you crazy. It could be your biggest demon. But when that obsessiveness is of something that could be of value, I think those people find their niche when they get into society. If it's something that's helpful, you see all the time stories of autistic learners that just have just unbelievable ability with numbers, and you could see how that's going to be very useful one day.
Oh yeah.
Without an ability to be a social, excellent communicator, who cares? They have their niche. So I guess part of what I would like to see is if that obsession is something that could be of value, let's let it bloom.
Yeah.
Let's let it come
and
out.
I think that was just kind of like the general thought behind why we chose to go to ladder route, with me just kind of doing my own thing and just kind of letting my talent shine through, as opposed to your original, the original part of the original question you are asking, whether or not we should make autistic people more like neurotypicals. And kind of building off of that, I would say it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult, but just because we don't necessarily have the same neurological structure. I feel like that's the main challenge, that we just don't know how to really. I just don't think we don't know how to adjust for that. I don't think we know how to incentivize kids to really learn how to communicate, or like a neurotypical, or at the very least learn how to communicate in a way that a neurotypical can understand.
Well, and if I could jump in here, because I think, my life, I can provide a little context. First, I do agree, Steve, with the latter of what you're saying. So I think we're all on the same page that this is not about, certainly not to me, about trying to make anybody on the spectrum more like a neurotypical. I think it's more harnessing that unique ability and perspective that someone on the spectrum can bring. And at the end of the day, this is where I think the rubber meets the road, is that no matter what we're talking about in life, I think there's always a human element, right? No matter what. And I know technology is changing, and we talked about a little bit, AI and all this stuff that's driving to less humanization of things. But at the end of the day, the world works because people hopefully are trying to provide value for other people and influence society. And we all have our unique, perspectives on those things, that's what makes the world go. But I think, Matt, where I'm going with this is, for you and I know you talked about, you weren't sure how much like a socialization would help you. For you and I to have a conversation, it's very easy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of that is through repetition. Your comfort level with me is really high, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember a time in the last, dozen years or more where I felt like you and I were struggling to get our points across, right?
Yeah.
In fact, many times we go around in circles over and over and over, and because we understand each other's point, we're trying to shift perspective, but the challenge for us to verbally communicate is not there.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and a lot of that comes through, obviously we're brothers, so we grew up together. We were, I was a primary figure early on for you and you for me in our socialization as kids, right?
Yeah.
We lived together. So where I'm going with this is, at the end of the day, I look at my life and the number of people that I had to learn how to socialize with, right? Because I was hanging out with Steve at a young age, all the guys in our neighborhood, school, etc. I was involved in sports, things like that. I think, Matt, candidly, because of your lack of interest as a child, right? You didn't want to step into that social arena because your mind was focused on other things. I do think you have the ability, and maybe you're not giving yourself as much credit, because we didn't do anything to learn how to communicate, you and I, besides be around each other, right?
Yeah.
We were open. We were vulnerable with each other. We weren't afraid to share how we felt. You were willing to risk offending me, and I was willing to risk offending you, and that created a very authentic conversation.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think because someone on the spectrum is probably going to be reluctant, whether it is fear or not, lack of skill set or just disinterest overall, I think we have to be looking to create environments, to your point, that would give somebody a reason to be interested in that conversation. Whether it's a topic or something that we can harness that they have interest in, that they don't even realize we're forcing them to socialize, but we'll start to develop those soft skills from a younger age. Because I mean, college especially, it's very, very easy to just, I could have gone through college and not spoken to anybody. Show up for the class.
And that's basically how I
know that's what you did. And I know that in the short term, I know that's what you wanted to do. But I do think that because that was the approach you took, you are somewhat, and I'm not trying to harp on you, you didn't know what you were doing, but I don't think that strategy benefited you.
And to be fair, you probably do have a point.
And I guess,
overall, I agree. We need to find a way to influence, or not, I wouldn't say influence, but more just kind of like incentivize kids on the spectrum to at least socialize a little bit more. And that's a challenge for educators, not just like yourself, but also employers. Because at the end of the day, part of actually working is just being a part of the culture that exists at any organization when you think about it.
I just think, listen, this is human nature, okay? If you have a bad experience doing something, doesn't matter how old you are or what it is, either you basically have two responses to that. Either you're going to avoid that bad experience because, I touched the stove, it's hot, I'm not going to do that again, right? Or you're going to figure out a way to touch the stove and it not be hot, so you go back to it. And my point with that is, I think for someone on the spectrum, because of your, the way that your brain works, right? There was probably an opportunity for very early on for you to have social experiences that were similar to touching the stove, right? Where you got burned. I mean, I've heard you say it, Matt, 1,000 times. You've gotten burned by employers, educators, whatever it may be. And I think that whether consciously or subconsciously, I think that shies you away from social interaction.
And to be fair, I think you do have a point. And I just think that we need to find a way to allow individuals on the spectrum to find their own ways of socializing, to find their own ways to build an oven mitt. So that way when they touch the proverbial stove, so to speak, they won't necessarily get burned.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my argument, and I'll let Steve chime in here because I've kind of been ranting, but I guess my argument is that there are ways, I believe, outside of a classic classroom setting in terms of here's your curriculum, here's what we're going to test on, here's where we're trying to get everybody to go, having something a little bit more unconventional that curates an environment. Because when the child's at school, the reality is you go to the classroom that you're assigned to go to, right? You go to the period. So there's not a lot of choice. I get it. You want somebody to be, to Matt's point, you want them to be on board and incentivized to actually make the most of the experience. But I do think that we're missing something from an education standpoint if we're not introducing this early on. I mean, I listen to a lot of psychologists on podcasts and YouTube videos and things, and so many of these skills are learned from a very, very young age. And if we're not curating an environment that incentivizes everybody, learning disabled or not, and maybe that means, getting certain IEP profiles together, right? People of similar interests or people on a similar path to where they're not going to be, it's not going to be too overwhelming. There's not going to be this huge disconnect, and creating environments where, again, I'm just thinking out loud, but this is where I think we ultimately need to go if we're ever going to really expect somebody to be able to go out independently in society and A, provide value to society, and B, find value and meaning for themselves, which ties into a lot of what we talked about the last time we were discussing autism.
I think where this really takes off, that socialization skill, is when someone finds their niche and finding people that share the same interests. That's where it takes off. You have to communicate with each other. You have to socialize with each other when you are in the same arena together. Whether that's, I don't know, Matt, I'm trying to think of things that were your niche at a very young age.
I would say sports was one. Sports was a big one. History and politics were another.
Mm-hmm. I'll use an example, Matt, just from our life. We go up to our lake house. Steve, you've been up there before. Kyle Freeman.
Yeah.
Okay. You and Kyle connect on video games.
Yeah.
Right?
Video games.
That you and Kyle have probably, if you were to count it up in your lifetime, you've probably only seen each other, 25, 30 times in your entire life.
I would say maybe a little bit closer to 50, but
okay.
I guess you're
50 times, but it's not like you guys you don't see each other but once or twice a year.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that seems about right.
But you have a great rapport.
Yeah.
You're able to go play video games because you have a mutual interest, right? And I don't think, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you're disinterested in interacting with him or in any way intimidated to go and hang out with Kyle when he comes to the lake and you guys play video games. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yes, that's a very accurate.
And I think that's really helpful to not get pigeonholed into just communicating with yourself and being alone. I think finding someone with which you can communicate with is so important, and having someone to share interests with you is so huge in developing those skills. I think that's where it has to begin, is identifying what are you interested in? And it could be anything. There's someone else out there that probably shares that interest. They might not be sitting right next to you, but we can find them.
And I do think, and I guess, we're coming up on an hour almost here, and we can go as long as we want, but I guess where I'm trying to, my ultimate point is that I don't think, because of the unique position that an educator has and a school system has, because of the fact that it's not really a choice to go, for a student or for a child, I mean, most of their parents are going to require it. They're positioned uniquely to introduce an environment like this, an extra period or whatever it may be, to find out maybe it's working on those IEPs. What are the common interests? Let's set aside the academic needs, and those are, again, I'm not trying to push those to be secondary because they're not, but equally as important is maybe introducing, more of a personal profile to that process that allows you to start connecting dots with other students within your system and maybe pulling people together to create environments where those soft skills can flourish, right?
Right.
Much like you create an environment for a test taker to flourish if you're reading their test aloud,
Right.
eliminating outside distractions. I do think in that system we're missing half the battle, because there's no doubt in my mind, Matt, that when you sit down for an interview, you're more than capable to do many of the jobs that you've applied and interviewed for. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty much fair.
I know that for a fact, but your ability to communicate that level of competency to somebody else, whether it's a hiring manager or a potential, someone that you're going to go work for, I think you are lagging in that skill set. And that's where, until you're able to bring that up, and I think conversations like today are helping in that effort, whether you realize it or not. But until we're able to bring that lagging skill set up to the level of competency that you have in other areas, I think it's always going to be a struggle for you to provide the value that you have and in turn receive the value that we all get when we're doing something or giving something, creating something in our jobs, in our personal life, whatever it may be. So,
and that's what school is all about, right? It's not just about filling your brain with all the content knowledge, but it's it's really just trying to prepare kids for their lives. It's basically trying to lay the foundation of how to learn, not just how to learn, but the willingness to learn and the willingness to really kind of grow and actually make change, not just in their personal life, but also for those around them. And we'll go back to the IEP process. One of the things that we definitely do is we'll put graphically, if we see that Matt is really struggling to, I'll just say conversationally, to spark up a conversation with someone, that'll be in the IEP. That'll be, Matt will have a list of goals that he has to work on, and he's either going to meet those goals or he's not. And there's a line of, Matt will do this once in a quarter and then 3 times in a quarter. And then, by the end of the school year, he's starting conversations with his peers, every other day. And that's something that, we make very individualized goals that don't have to be just Matt can memorize when the Revolutionary War started, because Matt's he's checked that box.
He's there.
The IEP process will take a look at the whole student and pushing them in these areas. So I think it is something that's happening, but to your point, Brad, of being, and every student is completely different. We're doing this with more of Matt in mind, but there's students all across the spectrum that we have to help them. Are we supposed to be helping them get to the neurotypical? Is that what we should be doing as educators? I guess it's an open-ended question. Yeah. Is that what we should do?
I don't think that there's a right or a wrong answer. I mean, everybody's unique, neurotypical or otherwise. So, just because Steve and I are sitting at this table as quote-unquote neurotypicals, we learn in different ways. We have some similar interests, some different interests, and we provide value in different ways, professionally and personally. So I think at the end of the day, it's all, to me, in terms of an IEP, and again, I'm not an educator. This is all just my personal bias, I guess. I just think we're trying to maximize each individual person and what their capacity is for society. And I do think that, at least through my experience with Matt and some other people in my life, that in order for us to maximize that, that potential, there has to come a time where that social, we have to step out into the world and be able to interact with one another. And Matt, I think that's where sometimes your biggest struggles lie.
And I have to agree. I mean, I would say, just to kind of summarize what Steve is saying, or at least what I think Steve is saying, we need to have a combination of both. We need to allow people on the spectrum or people with other disabilities to allow their talents to shine, but we also need to give them at least a chance to develop their social skills, at least to the point where they can actually socialize and be on par with neurotypical people. Mm-hmm. And so that way they can actually use these skills to let these skills shine through. That's kind of like the overall goal of education in this, or at least just educating people with disabilities today. So for me, I would say overall, that's kind of where we need to go, and I think we're definitely getting there. But I just don't think we're at a point, or at least just based on my personal experience, I'm just not sure we're at the point where a lot of people on the spectrum probably feel the same way that I do. So, I mean, I would say right now we've been talking for like over an hour. So just to try to wrap things up.
We've been communicating for over an hour together.
Yeah.
And Matt, you communicate well. I guess that's my point, is that when these environments are created where someone like yourself feels comfortable and able to be open, there's nothing about today's conversation that would cue me to think, oh, Matt has autism. Right? You've been able to verbalize everything. Yeah. You communicate well. Your thoughts are, obviously well thought out. You communicate them effectively. So I'm just trying to provide some conversation for how do we close this gap for you personally and for all these other students that, Steve's having an impact on and teachers across the world are having an impact on. How do we make sure that, the IEP for Matt as an adult results in a success story?
Yeah.
Right? Because
so at least to the point where I'm not left behind.
And I know that that's something that you feel like. I mean, we talked about this in the last autism episode. Yeah. Is that you do have a feeling of being left behind. And again, I'm just trying to provide some opportunity to discuss how we create more situations where you're getting out of life what you desire and providing the value that you can, understanding that everybody on the spectrum is going to provide a unique perspective.
Yeah.
And to go with that, if we can, another challenge that I see from my perspective is, are we giving these accommodations to a student just to get a certain grade? Because obviously for Matt, he got certain grades that don't necessarily translate to that same level of success. So should we be more focused on, and I guess this is for every student, and I don't know that there's an answer to this, but the skills that are necessary to survive in our world, in 2020. Because Matt's ability to tell me facts that I had no idea, political, historical facts. Matt has way more knowledge of that in his brain than I do, but that hasn't translated to having huge success in the corporate world, right? So how do we educate on those skills, and how do we make sure that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on a diagnosis? Okay, you have ADHD, so I'm going to give you all these accommodations. And how do we make sure it's not enabling them? I've given you all of this your entire school career, and then all of a sudden as an adult, it's not like your employer is going to make sure that you get all those same accommodations too.
I was going to say, the real world doesn't have a lot of accommodations.
And that's the scariest thing when I'm, in my opinion, over-accommodating some of these students. What am I setting them up for?
And that's, and again, we can talk all day. That may be a topic for, round 2 of our podcast, but I do think there's a fine line. I mean, are we just checking the box, so to speak? Are we creating an environment for someone like Matt to be able to go in and have a perfect test score, which in theory is what school, is somewhat about, getting the score that's required to pass. You either pass the class or you don't. But if you walk into an interview in a coffee shop and people are yelling, stuff's going on, in and out the door, people are behind the counter, a lot of external stimuli, a lot of loud noises, and there's nothing about that environment that's accommodating, and society is expecting Matt to be able to go in there and execute an interview that has the potential to change the trajectory of his life. So that test that he passed,
I mean, does it really matter?
there's no, it has no utility for what he's actually facing. And
I think the shift is starting to happen with placing so much value, so much weight on a certain test score. You know, I just read the other day that Indiana University is throwing out the SAT as a means of prerequisite. I think an autistic student, if they can prove that they have a special skill or talent, to get paid in the real world, you have to provide some kind of service, some kind of skill. And that's what it's all about, identifying what that is. So identifying what it is that you think one day could be your niche, could be your service to the world. If you could identify that would be, let's say you're really good at working with your hands. I don't care that, should we care that you don't pass the calculus class? Who cares what they got in 6th grade language arts class, right? Because when you get down to it,
it's not going to help you one way or another, and I'm just thinking in terms of Matt, because that's largely been my experience. I think I'm not trying to put this all at the feet of education either, because I think the whole other side of this is the corporate world being equipped to accept somebody who maybe doesn't have the neurotypical approach, right? And what I mean by that, just to use somebody who works with their hands. Let's say it's let's say it's somebody who is a craftsman, right? Yep. They build stuff. Well, they're on the spectrum. They're not a great communicator. If we sit down in that Starbucks interview in that environment, I may not be able to tap into that talent pool. So from a corporate standpoint, in that regard, it may make a lot more sense to look at a portfolio of work.
Yeah, who cares how I say it? Let me show you.
Correct. Let me show you all these different things that I've done, especially for somebody like Matt. I mean, Matt, you have political ideology documents, you have different websites, you have different sports that you've created. I mean, you have so much, the podcast, you have so much content out there to support the fact that, hey, I actually have something here that can provide value. Your ability to communicate that might not be as strong as others, but I would love I just think about my own experience in interviews. I mean, it's personality tests, it's phone interview, it's video interview, it's interview panel with questions coming from all different angles. None of that really replicates anything like I do in my job. I mean, truly, it doesn't I can present, and I take great pride in my interview ability, but it's not super aligned with what I do day in and day out. That actually moves the needle in my profession. So I guess my point is, we do have to look to the other side of this in corporate America and say, okay, are our interview practices outdated? Are the way that we're hiring people, too antiquated in terms of, you submit a resume, then you get phone screened, then you go for a video interview, then they bring you in. I mean, it's like my brother's Brian is going through this right now. I mean, a lot of this stuff is repetition. You get asked the same
certain
questions.
Jobs should have the ability to not have the traditional interviewing process.
And I do think,
because here's the thing. I mean, just my experience alone, I have had over 100 interviews. Like, I think it's 170 now at this point. And
face-to-face.
Well, not face-to-face. It's basically a combination of either phone, video, or face-to-face.
But talking to a live person.
Yeah, but talking to a live person. I mean, you really kind of start to notice that you're right. I mean, it is antiquated. It is outdated. I mean, this is not necessarily the best way.
It's not playing to your strengths.
It's not, agreed. But what I was going to say is it's not really a good way of identifying value.
It's not playing to Matt's strengths, but it's also not maximizing the opportunity for the company itself, right? You may be passing on candidates who can provide exponential value to your company based on a set of criteria that another individual can pass, but not be able to provide that same level of value. You know what I'm saying? So you're testing them on something that is not relevant to what's going to be required for them to succeed in their role. And I do see that across the board. I mean, Matt, I know you've applied to over 2,000 jobs. Maybe it's closer to 2,500 at this point.
Oh, it's past that now. But
So I mean,
And of those jobs, are, would you say the majority of them, that social piece is going to be a huge part of what you're going to have to do?
for some of them, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to find work as an IT support technician. So for me, customer service is probably going to be required. But it's not that I can't provide that. I know that I can do it.
and I think especially as you get, anytime you have tenure at a company, and this goes for anybody, when you recognize your coworkers, you build up a little bit of rapport. I mean, we all have butterflies the first day we walk on the job. If you're there for 5 years, I mean, I have a certain level of comfort with my coworkers now at Shaw. So, of course, I'm more at ease. It's easier for me to communicate. It's easier. It just goes back to our relationship, Matt.
Yeah.
We've been doing this for 27 years. So, of course, it's easier for you to talk to me than somebody that's walking down the sidewalk. And that case is true in your, for your career. If you were to be given the opportunity as a support technician and you had coworkers who were coming to you to get, service for whatever their IT needs were, you would be able to build up rapport over time and thus be more effective with the communication piece. You may never be as strong as someone like me, who it comes very naturally for, but you don't need to be. And I guess my point is that, yes, can we do things from an education standpoint that can help bridge the gap? Certainly. But I guess the whole theme of this conversation is that right now, as I see it, and again, I've been out, it's been several years since high school and college for me, and for Steve as well, but I think there is a massive disconnect between the things that we are requiring of a student all through high school and college, and then what's actually happening in the real world for them to provide value and find meaning in their life. There is a disconnect between what is taught and what is required in the general sense. And I'm setting aside law, doctors, things like that are extremely specific, right?
Yeah.
Where if you get your medical degree, you're a doctor. I mean, that's basically what it is. So there's some niche things, but I do think that I just think there's opportunity, and that's really the whole point behind this conversation is, maybe somebody out there that is an influencer in either of these spaces, education, corporation, whatever it may be, can maybe say, you know what, let's take a look at this. Maybe there is an opportunity to do something a little bit differently. So we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say that's a pretty good summary overall of this conversation and what we really need to do in order to provide people with autism or any other learning disability at least the opportunity to actually kind of find value in both their corporate careers as well as their personal lives. So I would say I think it's a good time to wrap it up. We've been talking for over an hour.
Yeah, hour and 17 minutes. We can certainly bring this thing in for a landing. I want to say thank you to Steve for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This was we had no notes, we had no prepared questions. We just kind of wanted to pick his brain, and he provided a lot of great context based on his experience and his career, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on again. We can maybe continue this conversation. Obviously Matt and I will take into account some of the feedback, comments that we get from posting the podcast, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, guys. This
All
was
right.
fun.
Yeah, this was great. We need to do it again. All right.
We'll see you.
See ya.